Friends, over the last 20 years, there has been a revolution in board game design. And I want to convince you that if you haven't played any of the new games, if your idea of a board game is something like Risk or Monopoly, you're really missing out. The old games are actually pretty bad. I look back on them and shake my head. I think many of us as kids had an experience where we would get together with our friends for an evening of board games, start playing Monopoly, and then you would be kicked out of the game early because you got some bad luck or made a bad deal or something. And then not only did you just lose the game, the other people would keep playing, so you'd be bored, and it would start to seem like people were feeling compelled to go into the minute details of every deal to get every possible benefit. It just felt like it was dragging on too long. The new games fix a lot of these problems. I want to claim that the difference between the old games and the new games is comparable to the discovery of perspective in art. Before people understood perspective, art was just sort of cartoony and silly looking. Whereas once people understood perspective, it suddenly became this whole new world. And I'm going to talk about some of the insights that the designers have had in developing this art form. Let me start with the question of negotiation and bargaining and diplomacy. A lot of the classic games involved discussions between the players. You would try to convince the other player to buy your product. You would try to convince them to attack a certain rival. Lots of things that involve talking and negotiation. It turns out this is actually not such a good mechanism. The reason is basically just that it takes too long. People love to talk. They love to wheel and deal. And if you let them do that, they will go on forever. And another factor is that it allows external psychological factors to influence the game. As an example of this, I would often play games with my cousin and his mother, who was my aunt. And I would always lose these games because my cousin could always convince his mother to go along with his point of view or take his side of the bargain. Another bad mechanism in games is attack the leader dynamics. So what happens in a lot of games is you have a pattern where a leader emerges and then all of the other players start to attack that leader. Then the leader falls and a new leader emerges, and then a new alliance forms and they try to attack that leader. That's a bad pattern because it tends to produce very long games. And also it creates a sort of disincentive in the early part of the game to play well. Let's say you have a 2-hour game, but you have an attack the leader pattern. In the first half of the game, there's no real reason to play well, because if you do, the other players will just attack you. So in the first half of the game, you just act like a dummy. And then maybe in the second half, you start playing really well. But what's the point of having a 2-hour game? You should just have a 1-hour game, if that's the case. A third area where the new games have really revolutionized the field is that they have better game end conditions. So in the classic games, there's this question of how we decide when the game's over. And the natural thing that most of those games did was have a last man standing condition. As the game progressed, some players would get kicked out, and whoever was still in the game at the end was the winner. That's not a very good way to end the game, because if you get kicked out of the game, not only did you just lose the game, you're also bored while the rest of the players finish up the game. It's not a good idea to kick people out of the game. So it's not a good idea to use this last man standing rule to finish the game. The new wave of games has usually a condition where you run out of a resource and that ends the game, or maybe the players get to a certain level, they build a 7-story building, or they build 6 structures, that kind of idea ends the game. And that has a nice benefit, which is the length of the game is predictable. I think a lot of people have had an experience where they sat down to a game and they thought it would be 2 hours, but then it ended up being 3 hours and maybe 4 hours. And this is really not fun. Even if you're enjoying the game at the beginning, some people just can't sit for 4 hours. That can be really uncomfortable. So if you have a nice predictable game length, you can say, all right, I've got 2 hours, I can invest this amount of time, and we're going to finish the game in that length. I want to finish up by mentioning an interesting cultural and historical background to this new wave of game development. This is that the new wave has come mostly out of Europe, and in fact, primarily out of Germany. And the reason is that Germans like to play board games, but also they have this uneasiness with the idea of conquest as a theme for a game because of German history. They don't necessarily want their kids to be playing games that are about global domination. So the German game designers started experimenting with themes other than conquest. And in fact, if you think about it, this theme of conquest is the background for some of these bad game mechanisms, right? Like last man standing is a consequence of conquest as a theme. Attack the leader is a consequence of conquest. So because of this uneasiness with the theme of conquest, German game designers started exploring new themes, more peaceful themes, more friendly themes, and that led them to develop different game mechanisms. And these mechanisms are actually much better than the classic games have. I encourage you all to try out some of the new Euro-style games. Agricola is a classic new one, I should say. It's about farming. Settlers of Catan is probably the game that defined the new genre. And it's actually interesting because it's the first member of the new wave, which means it still has some of the mistakes that the old games had. There's a lot of arguments that come up in Catan. And finally, Obsession is basically Pride and Prejudice as a board game. I encourage you to check it out. Thanks a lot.